As our former ministers were joking with me about the time allotted, I realized I probably should have brought a bell down with me just to bring them off. They did a good job. The year was 1875. Just 10 years after the Civil War, the era of Reconstruction was nearing an end, and the country was still fighting over what a post-war life would look like. Ulysses S. Grant was in the middle of his second term as president, but was navigating an economic depression that began in 1873 and would continue for several more years. During that depression, around 18,000 businesses had closed, and by 1876, the unemployment rate in America was estimated to be 14%. The population of Waynesboro was somewhere between 500 and 1,000. Yet for several decades, God had been planting seeds of a uniquely Baptist expression of the church in this Waynesboro area. Finally, on December 10th, 1875, on a Friday night, Waynesboro Baptist Church, which would eventually become First Baptist Church of Waynesboro, was officially constituted with a membership somewhere around 45 to 55 members. Some of the records are unclear. One of my favorite stories from that early history in those days was the story of the first baptisms here at First Baptist. The church did not have a baptismal, so they baptized new believers in the South River, which they did on December 21st of 1875. A newspaper report of that day says there was ice on the stream, but no one suffered any ill effects. In the dead of winter, they gathered along the banks of a river, entered those cold waters, dedicating their lives to Jesus, and were baptized into the family of this church. Talk about commitment. I'm not entering that baptismal pool unless the heater's been on for like 24 hours, at least. And they entered the South River just before Christmas because they had believed that God was up to something in their lives. And they entered those chilly waters, and God met them there. And those baptisms became testimonies of the work of Christ happening in this little newly formed Baptist community. I imagine that story became a monument moment, not just in their lives, but for the life of this new church. A story that got told and retold every time they gathered on the banks of the river. I am sure someone said, "Remember that cold day in December 1875? Was a testimony of God's faithfulness and grace, of a legacy that God was beginning to write. In our passage for today, the Israelites also enter a river. God had delivered them from slavery in Egypt, promised to take them to a new land, and for 40 years in the wilderness they wandered. God provided, and they continually wondered, when would God's promise be realized? The moment finally came. The priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant enter the waters of the Jordan, and just like what happened in the Red Sea when they were leaving Egypt, the waters of the Jordan stopped flowing, rising like a wall on their right side, and the whole nation crossed on dry ground. Now this entire nation was on the west side of Jordan, standing in a land that they had hoped for and dreamed of for 40 plus years. And the Lord tells Joshua, one person from each tribe, 12 in total, send them back into the river, to the dry ground. Grab some stones from the feet where those priests stood when the waters ceased flowing. Carry these stones with you to the place where you will camp and set up a monument there. Now, we don't know exactly what this monument looked like. Maybe it was just a pile of rocks, like Pastor Kristen mentioned earlier. But the place where they camped was called Gilgal, which means stone circle. So it's possible these stones were set up in a circle. And notice it's not an altar, it's a monument, an anchor point for their story as a people of God's faithfulness and grace. A story of how the improbable, even the impossible, broke into their story. In fact, the very purpose of this monument was so that their children and their children's children throughout the generations would come, and when they asked that question, what are those rocks there for? Whomever was holding their hand in that moment would say, well, let me tell you a story. It was a moment when the river was overrunning its banks, and yet God stopped it from flowing, and we crossed on dry ground. These stones shall become, for the Israelite people, a memorial forever. The stones became a physical marker that compelled the people of God to testify to the enduring legacy of God's work of faithfulness and deliverance. God keeps God's promises, and you know how we as an Israelite people know, because we were wandering through the desert. But when God told us to cross the river, we were scared. We didn't know what would happen. But the moment those priests' feet hit the water, it stopped flowing, and we walked on dry ground. And this testimony kept the legacy of God's work alive in the community for each new generation of God's people. We are gathered here this morning to celebrate 150 years of God's faithfulness and grace in and through First Baptist Church. 150 years of discovering and rediscovering God's presence and call. 150 years of changes and challenges, some welcomed and eagerly met. I would imagine some unwelcome, and God had to drag us kicking and screaming into the future. 150 years of service to this community and around the world. 150 years of growth and transformation, one heart at a time, one life at a time, one day at a time, 1 year at a time. 150 years of cultivating a congregation that became a family. I think of all our 50-plus year members here this morning. If you are one of those, would you raise your hand? 50-year members. Such a testament to the legacy of this church, the spirit of love and life present here. Now, I've not been here for many of those 150 years, but in my short, almost 2 years, I can tell that if you're here this morning, you're here because this church is filled with 1,000 monument moments that compel you to tell a story. For the legacy of First Baptist ultimately isn't carried through bricks and walls with a steeple on top. These buildings are just the memorial stones that compel us to tell the story of what God has done. Stories of mission trips and the work that was done, homes built, lives transformed by the presence of God alive in and through the people of this church. Stories of loss and grief where the comfort of God was carried through the people of this church who showed up, complete with a casserole and a prayer. Stories of lives being transformed by the power of the good news of Jesus, the one who carries forgiveness and grace, healing and hope, where lost souls at a crossroad are met by Jesus, carried through the people of this church. Stories of a new family born not of blood, but sewn together by the Spirit through work and worship, Wednesday night meals, and open Bibles, asking difficult questions and inviting God to be present and speak. No, the church is not the building, it's a people, but this place is a memorial for each of us. Through it, God connects our stories and weaves together a legacy that is alive and, to David's point, will far outlive each and every one of us. This place, this church, has become for you, even if in just a small way, a circle of stones that beckons you, that calls to you, that invites you to remember a time when God showed up. In the Broadway play Hamilton, near the end, right before Alexander Hamilton dies, I'm sorry if I spoiled the ending for you, he goes through this monologue and he asks the question, what is a legacy? And the next line he answers, it's planting seeds in a garden you never get to see. Now, not to show any disrespect to Lin-Manuel Miranda, but I'm not sure I completely, wholly agree with that. While, yes, the final chapters of our story will ultimately be written by someone else, a legacy is born when we imagine a fully formed garden and work to make that dream a reality, day in and day out. A legacy is cultivated in those daily decisions we make and the lives that we touch and the way that God calls us, draws us, beckons us, and sometimes carries us kicking and screaming into the new world that God is bringing about through Jesus Christ. The legacy of First Baptist is something that is alive and breathing, ever-changing and born anew within each of us as God time and again shows up in us, around us, and through us. May First Baptist continue to be a memorial for each new generation, so that in 30 years or 50 years or 150 years, God willing, a new generation of children will be brought to this church and ask with their innocent curiosity, why is this church so special? And my hope and dream is that whomever is holding their hand in that moment will say, well, let me tell you a story. Friends, may our legacy not just be something we leave behind, but something we continue to live each and every day. Amen.